Good morning. I'm Katie Ramon, aka Kathleen, and I work for the University of Missouri. I am the systems librarian. So today we're kind of going to discuss the University of Missouri's reporting journey, how we first got FOLIO, and then how we came up with various methods to get the data we need. So I'm going to kind of start off with an introduction about how kind of University of Missouri's ILS staff team is made up of, and then get into our reporting needs, and then the methods that we use. And then we're going to wrap it all up in how we've made a decision to obtain a new product based on our need. So I just wanted to introduce the speakers. Besides me, there's also going to be Stephen Pryor, who's joining us virtually. He's the Director of Digital Initiatives at MU. The University of Missouri has 4 campuses, one at St. Louis, Rolla, and Kansas City, and Columbia, which is the main campus. We also, part of our consortium is the State Historical Society of Missouri. So I just want to give credit. This is everyone that are members of our ILS team, and we meet every Monday morning to discuss ILS problems and to provide updates. So I just want to give them credit. So a little bit about the University of Missouri. So we completed our migration to FOLIO in 2022, and we're hosted by EBSCO. So all of our campuses share one FOLIO tenant. And the reason is, well, of course, the consortial support was not available at that point. So each campus is an institution which has libraries and then their locations. There's a FOLIO site coordinator for each campus. So they're kind of the initial contact if someone has a problem with FOLIO or the integrated products, which include, we have Panorama Essentials, which is a reporting program provided by EBSCO, which I'll go into more detail. And we have Classic EBS currently. And being the systems librarian, I kind of support all campuses. If there's a problem or a system-wide issue or a system-wide change, such as an upgrade, it kind of moves up to me. So overall, we have 37 libraries. We have 504 locations, and we have about 9 million items and about 120 CERCs last calendar year. So first to go about what it is reporting, and that's kind of a open-ended question here. We just kind of consider anything kind of data that is extracted for FOLIO or integrated products, such as EDS or ERM, etc. And it's basically a way to share data with staff, and they can manipulate it for their own needs. You know, and usually a report starts because a library staff member has a specific question, and we need to create a data extract or report to answer that. And of course, that varies by the audience, whether, you know, it's the acquisitions department or circulation. So to kind of go into UN reporting needs, I won't go over all of them, but it's the typical ones. How many instances, holdings, items, who cataloged what, of course, checkouts, and of course, and the, you know, ARL and ACRL surveys. And we have a particular thing with those surveys is even though we're one system, if say someone at Columbia checks out an item from Kansas City, we consider that an interlibrary loan. So checkouts by service point are especially important since we consider those ILLs. So when we started, we had Panorama Essentials, and then we kind of just had API and the Folio user interface. So we used user interface, Panorama, and then we use API queries and flows through Postman, which is a way kind of to join multiple queries. And then we kind of combine reporting methods. Let's say I can get everything in the list app except shelving order. Well, I can put that in the API flow and get the shelving order. So most of you are probably familiar. I'll try to be quick about this. So the Folio UI, you can export search results, the circulation log. You can kind of use bulk edit as a reporting tool, the list app, and then the CAN reports and various apps. So with the exporting search results, you can do that for various apps, the invoices, licenses. You can get MARC records out, authority records. A lot of times the request app, for example, here, if you want a list of all the holds for a certain service point, a lot of times we just go to the request app and export that instead of doing that kind of API query or something like that. And one of the other thing is, if you want to use a different tool to get additional information, you can get instance item UUIDs exported as well, and then plug that into a different kind of reporting method to get all the additional information you need. I use the circulation log a lot. I mean, you're counting rows, you don't get a count, but say you just need circulation by service point, which is a big thing here. I can export, you can narrow it down by certain date range. I export everything into CSV and then filter it down to certain service points and then count rows to kind of get a circulation count. So the bulk edit app, and this is kind of something we used before the list app came along. So you can, with the bulk edit app, you can obtain record identifiers you need through something like the inventory app or the list app, and you can plug them into bulk edit, and they have a lot more fields. For example, loan type is not available in the list app, but I can get loan type in bulk edit. So instead of going through taking the identifiers and going through a Postman flow, which we'll discuss later, which can be kind of slow for them to filter down to get all that information, it's an easy way to get that. So you just start the bulk edit and just export it. You don't, and before you actually would do the modifications. One thing about the bulk edit app is though its function, of course, is to make changes to a certain location or add item notes or something like that. So it gets rid of duplicates. So if you were trying to get item information about circulation, you don't want things combined like that. So that's just one thing to be aware of. And then the list app, which came about in the Poppy release. So it's going to get out of beta in Quesnalia, which we're upgrading to next month. So you can get either item, user, and loan records. And with Quesnalia, you can also get instance information, organizational data, and purchase order lines. So there's limited fields available. One thing that I really miss is shelving order. As we all know, Library of Congress is not, call numbers are not easy to sort. There's a complicated formula you can use in Excel. So that's kind of one thing that I kind of miss. And also volume information is not available as well. So there are some delivered reports like missing items, inactive patrons with, open loans. Another thing to kind of be aware of is that you probably know their permissions are not granular. So let's say you have a library staff member, you just want them to have access to the circulation functions, that they can just check in, check out things. Even if you don't have access to an app normally with your Folio username permissions, you can access that record in the list apps. So if you don't have access to a user app with your Folio account, you can get user record information, because you can run any kind of list, any kind of record type. In the Ramson's release, which is after Quiznalia, you can limit it by record type. Another thing we came across with Poppy in Quiznalia testing is that acquisitions units for the POLs is not limited to, you can see everyone's POLs, if you're beyond what's in your acquisitions unit. So then, in our institution, each one of our campuses has an acquisitions unit. So and we kind of lock things down. So that's, kind of an issue for us. And one of the reasons that we haven't really opened it up to all library staff. And then finally, you have the canned reports in the apps. For example, you can get a list of overdue items. You can get like a hold clearance report to see which holds have expired, and stuff as well. So with the Folio UI, kind of in summary, what you can get is you can get shelf lists and waiting lists through the list app. But of course, shelving order and volume is not available, which is, your selectors might not be too happy about that. You can get like item lists by status, user loan information, what kind of overdue list of users have overdue items. You can get financial transaction information, information about requests, acquisitions data for orders. There's a lot of exporting options available for the acquisition apps. And then of course you can get some search stats from the circulation logs. So some of the issues, of course, are the fields available. It depends on the app being used. For example, in bulk edit, you have access to loan type, but you don't have that in the list app. And we, of course, use loan type as our main method for circulation rules. So we really focus on loan type. So that's kind of the issue. And of course, you're getting a list. You're not getting a quick count like you would through API, if that's what you're looking for. And so what ends up happening is that you need to go to additional reporting program in order to get those fields that are missing. So I'll go over a little bit about Panorama. So this is a product, and Panorama Essentials is the basic one. There's also a full Panorama in which you can have additional data sources besides Folio, like if you want, some electronic resource information or something, put it in there so you can compare. We just have the basic, which is just Folio. It is based on Tableau, and you have workbook and dashboards options. So you can create workbooks in tabular format or using the visualizations and put them into a dashboard. So you can put multiple workbooks in a dashboard. So they come with the EBSCO data sources there's only certain fields available. So there is a circulation detail and circulation overview data sources, but you don't have all the fields that you normally have if you had full access to Folio. And you can get requests, acquisitions data, ERM as well. You can get service point information. It comes with standard dashboards that EBSCO's created. And then you can create copies of those standard dashboards and modify them for your own. And I'll discuss that in a little bit. And you can create them from scratch. But of course, it's just based on what those data sources that EBSCO imports. So this is just a quick example of what a standard dashboard looks like. Usually there's some overview counts on the top, and then these are visualizations that kind of show trends over time. It's kind of, this is a custom dashboard. One of the things I noticed with the delivered one is, of course, we had multiple campuses and there was no filters for campuses or library. And it ended up those were hidden, and I unhid those so that way our individual campuses can get circulation counts and so forth. And also our library, a lot of people might be very impressed by dashboards, but our librarians are not. They want an Excel spreadsheet, and it's maybe because we were on Sierra previously and you had to create list apps, which was exported to CSV. So they really just kind of want a spreadsheet. So I just kind of did those and got rid of the visualizations. So what is possible, what you can get circulation stats based on like tenant policies, inventory and user policies. Recently EBSCO did add service point to circulation dashboards because of course we consider inter-campus lending ILLs. So we requested that. You can do collection management type reports based on the last checkout date, publication date, things like that. Any kind of inventory statistics, budget and other order information. We do have some of our librarians had a hard time. They really wanted ongoing orders and, one-time orders separate. So there was some issues with that. You can customize. It's great for viewing trends over time. If you want to look at your circulation in the last year in graph format, so you can see up and down or what the busiest times of the library are, it's great for that. You can see the data behind the visualization. There's an option to drill down and get the data behind it. But of course, the data has to be in that data source. So you're limited to what's in that data source. And so I think it's good for presentation purposes. Maybe something you put on a staff website to kind of show the circulation over time. But one thing is, so there's kind of some issues. Some are Tableau based restrictions, and then some are just kind of how the backend is set up. It is for analysis, not reporting, which I think for smaller libraries that want to see their circulation trends over time, that's okay. It's okay, but for us, we want to do deep analysis. So you can, of course, drill down to get the data behind it, but there's a lot of fields that are missing. So if you want to subscribe to a report, PDF and PNG file are only available. You can export a dashboard into tabular format, CSV or Excel, but you can't subscribe and have it delivered that way. And that's a Tableau restriction. And also with Tableau, it's the licensing. There's different types of license, like a creator, explorer, and a viewer. And so they have to be tied to an individual. So you can't with an individual email. So you can't just have one shared by all campuses or put behind an organization or something like that. intercampus lending and borrowing. Of course, we now have service points, so that should help. But that really was an issue with our ARL and ACRL stats. You're only limited to the data sources that EBSCO provides. And if you want to have an additional field, you'll have to do an enhancement request. And you know those, of course, take time. They have to take into consideration if other libraries besides you can benefit from it. You are not able to create your own SQL queries. The data comes in with SQL included. So you cannot join tables as well. And sometimes the fields and the filters that are included in Panorama are unclear. There recently was an update that you can see kind of the formulas behind it, but still I think some kind of reference guide is needed to explain each field. Okay, so Stephen's going to take over the API part of it. So when all else fails, you have API. So then you have a lot more possibilities. And I'm going to go ahead and let Stephen take over and discuss API.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
All right, great. I want to point out, Katie, before you go too far, there's a question in the chat about the second Panorama slide with the description of null and 126 items. The question is, what does that mean, specifically the null? And so if you're not able to back up on that, it was the slide with the owning item campus name. Yeah, right there. Null of 126. So the question is, what does that mean? What type of item is this? Also, are you able to do LCSH searches on Panorama?
So the null, I can't think offhand what that, I don't know if I've looked at the data behind it to see what those items are.
Katie, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Those are related to Shishmo, it seems like, and they don't circulate materials. Is that correct? The State Historical Society doesn't circulate anything.
Yeah, these are checkout counts though.
Right, so they wouldn't have any checkouts because they don't circulate items.
Well, but they do have a item in the list there, SHS, right, St. Louis. What I would say about the nulls is that sometimes these data exploration tools are ways to find strange things in your source data. So it's possible that we have some records in there that maybe came from the very beginning of our migration. We've found over time that the migration of our data from Sierra into Folio, that there's some weird hiccups in there, and some of these tools have allowed us to find those things and fix them up. So maybe checkout records came over from Sierra that don't map to a location or something like that. It's a small number.
Yeah, that I was thinking the same thing. It's just it can't find a campus, and yeah, it's probably the circulation records that migrated over from Sierra. Is there any other questions in the chat before we move on?
I think that was it.
So I will go back.
All right. Great. So one of the things, subject heading searching in Panorama.
No, there is a data point called subject, but it's based on the LC or DOE call number, but subject headings are not available.
Yeah, right. All right. If you are looking at the Folio UI, everything that you see there ultimately comes from an API. So Folio is completely API based, and the UI is a sort of a front end onto some API calls that are happening in the back end. If you hit, it might depend on your browser, but on mine, I think it's usually F12, brings up the web developer tools. There's a network tab, and you can actually see the calls that are going on the back end when you load a page. And you can find out what those API endpoints are for where Folio is getting the data that you can see. And so once you know that, or you can go and visit the documentation. There's a Folio wiki, and I have a link that I'll paste in here if you haven't seen it. But once you get the API calls, you can use a tool. And one of the tools that we use is Postman. And then I'm also familiar with Python. And so I use Python a lot. Or you can paste an API call into either Postman or a Python script and retrieve some data from it. So Postman, I mentioned, is a software application. Here's the link. It takes a little bit of setup to get started to do some of the things that we do with it. There's the link to the Folio wiki if you're not familiar with it. But it's one of the tools that we use to get started. And in its simplest format, thanks, Katie, for the slide. In its simplest format, what you sort of don't see above this window on the left is that there's a box where you paste in that URL for the API endpoint that you could get from spying on the back end with your browser development tools. And once you're set up, according to the wiki link that I pasted in there, Brooks has a comment in the chat, and Brooks was involved in our migration data, so he'll have some good insight on that that I'll come back to in a second. You paste the API endpoint into Postman, hit send, and once you're set up according to the wiki with the authentication and the tokens and all of that to your API, it'll come back with something on the left, which is the JSON data corresponding to the results of the API call. That link to the wiki on the left also has a page on it about setting your Postman up to visualize this JSON as a table, which is what you see on the right. And so that's a little bit more friendly way to view that block of code that's on the left. And then, so once you have it in the table on the right, you can select Control C and then Control V, paste it over into Excel. And that's something that we do quite a bit if we want a specific piece of data. Like in this case, it looks like it's a list of check-ins. So we can run, there's an API endpoint for check-ins that you can add queries for a service point. So you can see what items were checked in at a particular service point. If you want, you can add date qualifiers, all that kind of stuff, and then get something like the data on the right. One thing that I want to point out about that data on the right, you can see it. You have the date and time that it occurred. You have item ID. You have item status prior to check-in, which is an interesting thing that I'll come back to in just a moment, I think. You have item location ID, service point ID. So the way that Folio works is that the information is chunked up into all these little sections, right? And so an API call like this is going to give you the list of check-ins, but then all the other data is out there under these other IDs, these UUIDs, that you then have to, maybe, if you want that particular part of data, have to go and hit another API endpoint to get. Or you could have it saved somewhere already. So like potentially your list of locations, if they don't change very much, you could download them once and then retrieve them from that list rather than hit the API endpoint again. So before we hit the next slide, Brooks says the null results could be related to changes or deletions of service points between when you went live on Folio and when Panorama began to ingest data. So if service points have been deleted, but their IDs were still in the loan record, that could explain the null results. And that's, yeah, things like that is why we be careful if we're deleting things like service points or locations or anything like that, because then it won't resolve later when we try to do these lookups. Because again, this kind of endpoint, so like the check-ins data here with the service point ID, to see where that was checked in, we have to go and get that service point ID from the other API. And if it doesn't exist anymore, it'll come back as not found or null. All right, we can move to the next slide, Katie. So when we sort of have this chaining of things together that we need to do, so we get the list of check-ins, but then we need to know, well, okay, what are all these service point IDs? What are the item IDs? So the other thing we couldn't tell from that table, it had the item ID column with the item IDs, but then it doesn't tell us anything about what the item was. What were the titles, who, where the item is from, those kinds of things. And so we can get into this rabbit hole of kind of having to chase down little pieces of information across different API endpoints, and put together things from little pieces all around the Folio structure, data structure. And so for me, that is one of those things where I say, okay, I could put together a little script for it. And so what we have here in the screenshot is a little example of a Python script. There's a function up at the top that says get holdings by item ID. Down at the bottom, that's just a little snippet, but what I'm doing here is trying to see how many times an item with a particular statistical code was checked out. So the other thing that we might need to use this kind of data retrieval for is if there's a piece of data. So you might know that in a Folio record, various Folio records of all kinds, there's lots of places to stash data. There are fields, there are notes, there are lots of things that are, as of now, not necessarily set up to be searchable or queryable in all the little places that we've discussed already. It's kind of difficult. You can apply statistical codes to items, and then to some extent you can search that in the inventory app, or look for those things, and then you get a list of instances, and you can export that list of instances, but it doesn't necessarily give you the items, right? And so then if you go to lists, because lists will give you a list of items, well, lists is in beta, and statistical code is not one of the fields that you can create a list on, right? And so if we want to get the list of items checked out with a particular statistical code, we kind of end up down this rabbit hole of, we do a search for items with the statistical code, then we check, that gives us some instances, then we have to look at each instance and find out which items have that statistical code applied. Then we have to get some information about the items. Then we have to get the loans for the particular item, right? And so that's kind of what this code does. It's a nested series of loops that does exactly that. It gets the instances, looks at the items, looks at the loans on the items, and then puts it together into a table that I can then export. Next slide, please. And this is an example of the table, and it puts together all of that kind of information that I've had to retrieve from the different API endpoints through the script and through the looping. So instance ID, title, OCLC number, that's one of those little nuggets of information that's hidden away in a in an identifier field, and you have to look through. Some of our items have lots of identifiers applied, and so you have to figure out which one it is. Holdings location, so that comes from the holdings. That's another part of the loop, going to the instance, looking at the items, getting the holdings for the item. And so when you set up these kinds of scripts, thankfully you can set them up. They're generally repeatable. You can set them up to run unattended or on a schedule. And we have a couple of these API scripts that we do run on a regular basis. And one of them is that this is basically how our patron load works. Every night we have a process that gets our patron data from the university system, and then another process that writes it into Folio through the API on the users. And then another one that we had to come up with recently was we found out that when you create an order, it creates an instance if you want it to. And so our acquisitions people like to do that. They like to have Gobi or whatever their provider is create the instances in the system when they place an order. But by default, they're not suppressed. I think this was something that was going to be fixed at some point. It's about time I circle back and check on that because it's related to do with the way the items are created. But they were coming in and they were not suppressed. And so we had an API call. We figured out an API call that would look for items that were on order and unsuppressed. And then they would suppress them and send us an email overnight telling us which records it suppressed. And so we were able to run that on a schedule in the back end. So I think we, next slide. Thanks. So when we're looking at this kind of thing, what's possible? We have access to all the Folio fields. The check-ins table that I looked at before, for example, was one of the reasons that we might look at that is to figure out what our in-house use transactions are. As of now, that was not something that we have in the Panorama dashboard. How to count in-house uses. And so we figured out that the in-house use is basically a check-in with a previous status of available. So if an item's not checked out, but then it's checked in at a service point, that's what happens when we have an in-house use, where somebody lays a book on a table and then our staff come in and check it in, but it wasn't previously checked out before. So we figured out a little call to figure that out and gather those statistics. We talked about statistical code. We have processes for patron blocks. Sometimes patrons get a block on their account that doesn't sync up with the database. Some issues with using the API. It can be tricky getting the correct query. It might take a little bit of experimentation to find the endpoint or to find the query parameters. depending on the API endpoint, the different API endpoints have a limit in the number of results. And so you might have to do a loop to get all of your data. Some of the API endpoints have a limit on the order of a few hundred results. And then there's storage APIs that might have a limit of a couple 100,000 results. And it's not always in the documentation which one is which. And so you might have to experiment or get used to sort of looping and paging through, making multiple calls to get all of the data. And there's a little bit of programming experience that's required, or at least helpful, in using Postman for the APIs, at least. But Postman's a little easier than going full code and writing like the API scripts. And then one other thing that I'll mention is if you're using the API to gather all of your data, one of the reasons that those queries are that those results can be limited in the numbers is because it's not necessarily efficient to always be hitting the API to like resolve the location IDs to locations, right? That's a data set that doesn't change very much. And if your script is constantly pulling down all of your locations to find out what an ID is or something like that, that can be less efficient than if you had it in a database already or something like that. And then the last bullet point there is post and delete. It can be really scary if you're trying to change data via the API. And so we do have a programmer in our systems department who helps us with some of these scheduled tasks, the patron data load, things where we're writing data to the API. We're really careful with writing and saving data. All right, next slide, please. Thanks. And so in some situations, we've seen where not all the data is in a particular API. We don't necessarily get everything we need from one of the FOLIO UI reports, and so we have to put some of these things together. We might grab a table from Panorama and then copy and paste something into Postman to get the rest of the data. Next, please. And so, yeah, we kind of use this a lot, a Panorama plus a Postman flow, list app plus Postman flow, bulk edit into lists app, Panorama boast into bulk edit, or like the a hold shelf clearance report, or the users report, the overdue loans report from the users app into a Postman flow. And we'll take a look at a couple of those real quick.
And for some, I just want to say, for someone that is just new to API, it's like a workaround.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it makes things easier. I'm like, oh, I get everything. I just need one thing. So for me, Stephen has a lot more API experience, so it's a good workaround for someone that is not as familiar with it.
Yeah, it's kind of a way. So what I described, the Python use case, is for like chaining these calls together to get the little pieces here and there. You can kind of stick Postman in the middle of some of these and sort of work around having to write up a whole script with that. And so just one of the use cases, I don't remember if we have. Oh yeah, we do. So what's possible is, it's basically endless once you start mixing and matching and combining these. It reduces the need for those complicated API queries with all the loops and sort of chasing data down through loops. If you can't write Python scripts, you can do that. Issues with it are if you have a large number of IDs. And so let's say that if we wanted our overdue loans report all the way back to the beginning of our folio, I don't know how many would be in there, several thousand. And, if we ran those IDs in, it would kind of, our Postman flow that goes and looks up each user ID would take a little bit of time. And then, of course, there's the, taking two spreadsheets and merging them together, or, even 3 or 4 spreadsheets and merging them together. They can be a little fiddly and time consuming, especially if it's something that you're doing all the time. Next slide, please. So just one example here. We're using List app to get the list of items with a permanent location in one of our libraries, the UMSL Mercantile Library. That gives us item barcodes, which we want to do something with. And so we can run this list in lists, put it into the Postman flow with the item barcodes, and then Katie has a flow here set up. And what the flow does is all of these little blocks in the flow are places where something is happening or data is being parsed. And then the little arrows are feeding it into the next step of the flow, where you can have another API call that has input and output. And then the arrow will feed that into another block where it's either selecting a part of that output and then arrowing it over to the next step. And ultimately, this flow here is giving her the shelving order from all of these barcodes at this particular library.
So we only have 3 minutes left.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, all the slides are on Sketch. If you want to look, just kind of go briefly. This is another one where we take the overdue loans report. We have campus as a custom field in the user record, and so the overdue loans report doesn't, of course, include that. So we will take the user's barcodes or the UUID and put it through a flow to get the campus information. And then so as you can see, this is complex. So really our needs were not met by using just the FOLIO UI, Panorama and API. And also just, API fills in the data gaps, but not everyone feels comfortable with API. And, there's limited options for staff to run their own reports. And with the list app development, we hope that that's more staff will feel more comfortable and have more options. And of course, as we said, combining everything is time consuming, right? So we are getting metadb. So then we came to this conclusion because, as you said, our staff like their cross-tab, they like their tabular data. A lot of these combining reporting methods are very time-consuming for me, and this way we can get access to all our folio data, including MARC and historical data from metadb. And we can create our own SQL queries, we can join data tables, but we also have a more user-friendly option for general staff with the reporting app. So that's kind of, we hope to get started with it in January and see how it goes. So I know it's lunchtime and we're over time. If you have any questions, I'm willing to stay longer to answer them. And this is our contact information, and it's also on those PowerPoint slides on Sketch if you have any questions. Are there, Stephen, are there any more chat questions?
Right before we hit the slide, there was a question of, have we considered metadb or
Yes.
LDP? And so, yeah, like I wrote in there that this presentation was kind of our journey from the beginning of, do we really need a separate database for this stuff, to figuring out that, yes, there's definitely a reason why to have it harvested into a separate database, learn the query language, and head that direction. Yeah.
Okay, any questions? Okay, well, thank you. Feel free to email us if you have any questions, if they come up, and I know everyone's hungry, so I'll release you for lunch. Thanks, everyone.